Bismillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for being here for this event, which is a collaboration between Goldsmiths University ISOC and the University of Westminster ISOC. This event is about the fiqh of menstruation. In other words, the Islamic legal rulings on menstruation, something that is very important for us sisters to know, as we'll live with our menses for at least half of our lives. With Ramadan fast approaching, it will be beneficial for us to learn the rulings, inshallah. This talk will be delivered by our esteemed speaker, who is joining us all the way from the US, Dr. Aysha Wazwaz. Dr. Aysha holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and is the founder of Gems of Light, which is an Islamic institution for sisters only, where the courses and the knowledge that is delivered is derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. If you would like to know more information, visit gemsoflight.com. Inshallah, the link will be in the chat. Before I hand it over to our speaker, I'd like to let everyone know that there will be a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, there's a code for Slido that we'll share in the chat, or you can just put your hand up at the end, inshallah. Now, without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Aysha Wazwaz. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Dr. Aysha.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So if I can ask you to enable me sharing the screen, please. To do that, you could make me as a co-host, and that'll give me the ability. So let the mouse go over my name, and then it'll give you more. Click more and make me a co-host so I can share the screen. Good job. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So inshallah, today we're actually going to be talking about a topic that, of course, is really important for women, and hopefully, inshallah, we'll be completing the topic, hopefully today, and answering all the questions. This topic usually is described as the complicated topic. I will clear it for you, and I'll show you that it's not as complicated as you think, because it's going to be really simple. If you just understand just a couple rules, you'll be able to understand the rest of the whole concept, and then be able to answer the most important questions related to your body that, of course, every single woman is going to need, whether married, not married, or even until she gets really old. It's a fact of our body. It's really sad to say that I would probably not be exaggerating if I had said that 95% of the women probably never heard of the word istihada. And many times they would assume that just by having any vaginal bleeding, that's basically an evidence and proving that she cannot pray, which is not quite right. So we're just going to be first looking at the slide right here. This slide, you could see, really simple. We've got circles, we've got some parallelograms, and we've got some different designs. Let's just look at it really quick. So understanding it, you're looking at three different, if you understand this part of it, you've understood 95% of the lesson. All right, so you've got three different types of bleedings. All right, the first type of bleeding is menstrual. Well, the menstrual for a normal, let's call it regular cycle, is every 21 to 28 days, and it happens after puberty for women. Now, the color and the smell, that is the period texture. We're going to use this word, the period texture, often, so pay attention with me right here. So the period texture is actually a reddish blackish, has an odor. I want you to focus on the part of an odor, because this is probably the easiest way to distinguish the different types of bleeding. It is also thick. When we say thick, we're talking about thick like syrup. You know, when you have syrup, if you were to put the syrup inside the water, inside the water. You could see it going directly inside the water without necessarily getting dissolved, compared to if you were to put dye, like a drop of dye or ink inside the water, you could see it pretty much disseminating within the water. So there's that difference. The one with the syrup is pretty much like the cycle one. The one that gets diluted is a different type of bleeding. So we're going to get there. The part about the clotting, although when we're talking about menstrual, most of the books of fiqh will say that this bleeding, the menstrual bleeding, does not clot. But I find that very confusing for women, although, yes, definitely there's not much clotting in the cycle. Well, that's because in istihada, or in this other type of bleeding, all right, that has more blood in it. This has less blood, but more of other items. All right. So the part about clotting, I don't want you focusing a lot on that, because it really is confusing for most women, and it's not during our modern days, let's say it that way, with sanitary items. You won't really find that something that is going to be helpful for you to distinguish. So you're going to look at the reddish blackish part, the odor, the thickness. Those are the three. What we're going to use is the period texture. All right. And there's the other part, which is the brownish discharge. If you get the brownish discharge during a cycle, during the time of your period, whether we're talking about brown discharge, different color discharges, we're going to talk about that, then with differences of opinions, whether it would be considered a part of your cycle or not, but whether we're talking about the beginning of a cycle or whether at the end. Why am I saying differences of opinions between scholars? Because you might go to an imam or a sheikh, and he will tell you that, no, that's not a cycle. And then you start getting confused when you probably would call me and I would tell you, actually, it is part of a cycle. Now, here's the thing. The brownish discharge is actually old bleeding, but the preponderant ruling, wallahu a'lam, is that the brownish discharge, if it is within the time frame of your cycle, it is actually considered as part of the cycle, whether that was in the beginning of your period or whether it was at the end of a cycle. Now, when we're talking about a cycle, then we come across, well, how long is the longest number of days, or are the longest number of days, or the shortest number of days? There are actually differences of opinions between scholars, really, because there is no hadith to actually reference that. Although the Shafi'iyya used that a woman tamdi al-mar'atu shatra, and they said half the time based on that hadith that she would not be fasting or praying. And they said, well, the word shatr actually means half, so therefore we could see that half is indicating that half of the time of that time is basically going to be the longest number of days. Well, there are differences of opinions on whether that hadith was speaking in literal stance, or whether it was actually speaking in a metaphor type of language. So regardless, just keep in mind there are differences of opinions between scholars. Hanafi regarded 10 days as the longest days of a period, 15 days as the Shafi'i considered the longest times of the period. We're not going to focus on that one now, later on. So the other part, so what's the difference when we're looking at menstrual sisters, menstruating sisters? So what does that mean? Well, that actually means it's haram for them to fast, haram for them to pray, or even have, of course, relations with their husband, and they would have to make up the fast but not the prayer. That's a pretty straightforward, and we all know this one. As for the postpartum, we're going to go in details, inshallah, in just a bit. As for the postpartum, it's different, really easy to distinguish, simply because it's after a 12-week pregnancy. Well, don't take the 12-week. We're going to get some more talk on that and some more explanation on that in just a bit, because it's not really just 12 weeks. We're going to explain it later on. So whether the pregnancy was due to, whether let's say the bleeding that resulted after a pregnancy, whether the pregnancy was terminated because of a miscarriage or whether it was an abortion, then that would still be considered. If it was a pregnancy of 12 weeks or 10 or 9 weeks and up, depending on the shape of the baby, all All right. If it's a 12 week and up, so we're going to roughly say it that way. All right. If it's 12 weeks and up of a pregnancy, the bleeding resulting from it is actually considered a postpartum bleeding, which is called nifas. Now, when you look at this, so the other question is, well, what are we talking about in terms of color? Well, as long as there's bleeding, whether we're talking about brownish discharge, whether we're talking about any type of a discharge that's not white, is actually going to be considered, if it is within the 40 days, the 40 days or 60 according to the Maliki, if it's within the 40 days after getting a baby, then that would actually mean it's postpartum or nifas bleeding. If at any time the bleeding stops within the 40 days, you would simply take a shower and actually start fasting and praying, and you are obligated to fast and pray. And of course, if you are married, to have relations with your husband. Now, one thing about postpartum, really similar to menstrual, is that there's no fasting, there's no prayer. In fact, she is not permitted to fast, not permitted to pray, and certainly not permitted to have any sexual relations. And she would make up the fast only. Now, here's the one that is really confusing: the word istihada. Istihada, it's not confusing, really. Let's look at it. So, the word istihada, when you look at it, think of any other bleeding. Think of a bleeding that's really similar to nosebleed, for example, finger bleeding, etc. But the only thing is that this bleeding is actually internal bleeding. So the sister has a vaginal bleeding other than a period or postpartum. So it's not a cycle. It's not time for her cycle. And it definitely doesn't have this texture. And it's definitely, well, she wasn't even pregnant. So clearly, we're going to go for the third one. In other words, it's an internal bleeding, whether a result of an illness, could be psychological illness, could be just a medication she's taking and it's affecting her internal organs, whatever it is, could be a psychological issue. All right. So in that situation, this is going to be called istihada. All right. So how do I know istihada? What is the texture of it? So the best and the easiest way to remember istihada, well, if there's no pregnancy, so simple, that's going to be right there. But if there was bleeding and it's outside of, first, you're going to look at the timing, all right? But let's look at the texture. The texture, it's any color other than white. There's no smell if we're talking about bleeding. But if there is any other texture, so if we're looking at green discharge, it's going to be having a smell. Or if there's probably, we're going to talk about that later on. So don't look at that no smell to thinking if it has a smell, then therefore any type of a discharge. We're talking about no smell when we're comparing it to the red, bloody discharge. That's the menstrual discharge. So that's why we're here saying no smell compared to the reddish discharge that we speak about when we're talking about cycle. All right. So istihada, there's no color. Sorry, it can be any color, no color. I'm so sorry. It can be any color other than white. It's not thick. So what does that mean? When it actually drops, it drops without any thickness. You could see it disseminating within the water without being thick and going with a thick texture. All right. So what does a woman with istihada actually do? Well, she does fast. In fact, she is obligated to fast. She is obligated to pray, and with differences of opinions between scholars on sexual relations. So this is just the first slide, and now we're going to explain it a little bit more. So when we're trying to take it one step at a time in order to make sure that we didn't forget anything. So remember, for the postpartum, we basically said bleeding after childbirth, it would be considered postpartum if the baby, whether aborted or miscarriage. Now, here's the thing, is that remember when we talked about the the baby and how long that postpartum is. So here's the thing, is that when you're looking at a shape that looks like this, and where you've got the ears are starting to form, the fingers are right there, the nose is right there, the eyes is right there. So that's usually within 12 weeks. So many times they are not necessarily 100% accurate on, depending, so, some sisters, they might actually have an irregular cycle. So probably miscalculated or something on, in terms of how old the pregnancy is. So just, you can ask them, did the fetus actually look like a baby with a human shape like that? So usually 81 days and up is usually when you would actually see this form. So if the form is like that, then she would actually say, well, this was nifas and so forth. We'll be taking the different rulings related to it. If a woman doesn't know how many days she missed, she must estimate the matter and make up what she believes she had missed. Now, the one thing that I would like to say is that many times the bleeding can stop within, so probably after 10 days, more or less. Then in that situation, she would make the ghusl, and ghusl actually means taking a shower. She would take a shower and actually start praying. But if she gets the bleeding back again, the discharge and the spotting back again, then in that situation, she would stop and then continue as nifas situation. And then if the bleeding stops within the 40 days again, then in that situation, she's got her nifas again. The postpartum, of course, when it's not permissible for a woman who is bleeding following childbirth to fast and of course to pray and fast. Let's move on. Most and least postpartum days, we've got the Shafi'iyya would say 40, the Malikiyya would say 60. But here's one thing, is that there's really no evidence on either of those numbers, and it was more of the athar, so more of the Sahaba's understanding, Sahaba's reports were the ones that actually had this space. So in other words, when you're looking at the 40 and the 60 days, you want to really look at the texture to help you see whether you're at the 40 or 60. And usually whenever the bleeding stops, then her postpartum is over unless spotting comes back. Okay, you can be extended to 60 days if you're saying that the postpartum, the bleeding is really the same texture as the ones that were before the 40 days. So what about the part about breastfeeding and breastfeeding women and of course fasting? So generally, why am I talking about this even though we were talking about the bleeding? So because a sister could be going through nifas, but although she might not have let's say broken her fast because of the nifas, but she probably broke her fast because she was breastfeeding, in other words, during that time. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. Okay, so generally breastfeeding and pregnant women are permitted to break their fast if they fear the children and the pregnancy. All right, scholars had 4 different opinions on the matter of pregnant and breastfeeding women and how they make up their days. And this is really important to mention because many times sisters are asking this sheikh and that sheikh, and they're considering that they got contradictory answers. Well, here's one thing, is that the reason why you might actually hear contradictory answers is really because even the Sahaba themselves had differences of opinions. So you look at Abdullah ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Umar, they both said, well, she just pays a fidya. So what does even the word fidya mean? So the fidya means for every single day that you had missed, you would, at least for the sake of and for the case of fasting and pregnancy, for every single day that you had missed, you would basically feed one needy person on behalf of that day. So you would calculate, let's say you missed 20 days of Ramadan because you were breastfeeding or pregnant. So fidya is not to be paid in a compensation for the days that you had missed due to nifas or due to a cycle. You cannot pay fidya. Let's say it again. I've had many sisters confuse that. Let's say it again. So you don't pay fidya and on behalf of the days missed because of a cycle or missed because of nifas which is postpartum. There's no fidya for missing fasting because of nifas or for missing because of a cycle. You have one option in that situation, which is to make it up through fasting. But if you had missed because you were nursing a baby, that's what scholars had differences of opinions on. So the first opinion, she pays a fidya and does not have to make up the fast on behalf of the days. All right. The second opinion is that she makes up the days and does not pay fidya. And they said, well, this is because it's the same thing as any other person, because the ayah says that whoever's not able to fast, then فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرَ, then they should make it on other days. Well, they said pregnant nursing women are really the same thing as a person that is ill. They're physically weak, and therefore they're not chronic for sure. Well, that means it's temporary. That means they could be doing it on other days, so therefore they should be doing it on other days, which is actually what I consider the preponderant. But the other opinions are actually Sahaba's opinions too. The third opinion says, well, she does both. She pays the fidya and makes up the missed days. The fourth opinion says breastfeeding women make up and pay fidya, and pregnant women. So they distinguish between the breastfeeding women and the women that are pregnant. And they said pregnant women make up only. And that's the madhab Maliki and Shafi'i scholars. All right. Now, the preponderant on nursing and pregnant women, wallahu alam, is that the best, wallahu alam, again, this doesn't mean that the other opinions, remember, theirs are actually Sahaba's opinions too. All right. The preponderant, wallahu alam, is that women make up the missed days and not pay fidya. So the reason for that is, number one, that the reason is actually temporary. So she is temporarily disabled for, let's say, for fasting because she's pregnant, probably getting dehydrated, or probably needing nutrients, or probably, the list goes on with women that are, and it's, by the way, it's not being spoiled. If you can't handle it because you're nursing and because you're pregnant, this is totally and absolutely understandable. It's extremely hard to explain because women's bodies and women's capacities are different from one woman to another. Dehydrated can actually be very dangerous on a woman's health and even on the baby's health. So you don't necessarily have to feel guilty if you needed to not fast because you're nursing or because you're pregnant, especially if the sister is nursing, all right, and the baby is less than 6 months old. Because after 6 months, if she is nursing, the baby is ready to take solids. So she is going to be able to substitute that timing for the nursing part and actually give the baby solids. She is able to do that at 6 months, so it becomes easier. And we would definitely encourage, if it's 6 months and older, that is the baby, and she needed to nurse, I would recommend, the baby is 6 months. You can substitute for solids. I would really encourage you to nurse the baby, but hey, at the end of the day, it's permissible. Who am I to actually decide for her when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her the permission? Also, the reason for the differences of opinions is really because of the hadith that is narrated by Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi. You could see it right there, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has relieved, this is a hadith, relieved the travel of half of the prayer and of the duty to fast, and has relieved the pregnant and nursing mother. So the hadith, inna Allah wada an al-musafir nisfa salah والصوم وعن الحبلى والمرضى. So you could see this hadith and where they regarded it. So they, the same thing, and where just like nisf salah, half the prayer and half the fasting, they regard it They regarded that, hey, the way that this hadith is adding hubla, pregnant and or nursing women, to the people that have a temporary reason to break their fast, they said, well, it's the same thing here. In other words, it's not a chronic thing for sure, then therefore they could do it at other times. Let's go for the part about cycles. So when you're talking about cycle after puberty, it's really easy to, speak about the texture now, because we said it was blackish red, and we talked about the odor. The thickness does not clot. That one, we talked about it. The general rule, this is a really important thing. The general rule is that all vaginal bleeding is menstrual unless proven otherwise. Give me a sec. Sorry about that. I had to close the door because my son was making too much noise, making his Quran muraja. So the general rule is that all vaginal bleeding is menstrual unless proven otherwise. Why is that even important? Because before you rule out that this bleeding is actually not a cycle or not menstrual, you actually need evidence, such as, whether there was a pregnancy, or whether there is no smell, or whether you're seeing it's not thick. So the general rule is that it is actually cycle, unless you are not finding a smell, or there was a pregnancy. Well, then we're going to talk about postpartum, if there was a pregnancy. And if it's not thick, then we're going to say, oh, this is actually not a cycle texture. This is something else. So why is it important? Well, menstruating women don't fast. It's haram for women, menstruating women, to fast, whether it is an obligatory fast or a nafil fast. And it's not valid. Her fast is not even valid, even if she does. But she has to make up an obligatory fast that she misses. So why is that even an issue? Hold on. This is not some sort of a punishment. So bear with me right here. The hadith is that the Prophet ﷺ actually said that, or Sayyidah Aisha actually said that the menstruation used to happen to us. So Sayyidah Aisha said menstruation used to happen to us, and we were commanded to make up fasts, but we were not commanded to make up the prayers. You could see this hadith is actually in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. So it's an authentic hadith. You don't have to feel guilty. In fact, not fasting is actually your form of ritual. Not praying is actually what you will be rewarded for, not the other way around. By implementing the commandments of the Lord Almighty to not pray, you're actually getting rewarded for al-imtithal. You're getting rewarded for submitting to the orders of the Lord Almighty. So don't think that it's a punishment. If a woman gets her menses when she's fasting, her fast becomes invalid, even if that happens just minutes before Maghrib, and she has to make up the fast. So what does that mean? Is that even fair, that a woman is actually, has been working all the time and has been fasting and abstaining from eating and drinking all the time, and she doesn't even get the reward for it? You will get the reward for it, but the ritual is not complete. All right, that ritual on that day is not complete. So you will get the reward for any form of let's say, of whether abstaining from eating, drinking, or even if you were walking down the road and you just happen to, I guess, come across a thorn and prick you, you will still be rewarded for it. This is not a punishment. So don't feel that, oh, I was fasting the whole day and it's not even considered. The ritual is not considered. But whatever deprivation you deprived yourself away from, dehydration, whatever form of hardship you went through for attempting to fast, the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually says, even if you had the intention to do something good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for it, even if you didn't even do it. So let's say you had the intention to donate $1,000, but then you got a bill, or your car gets hit while you were on your way to actually donate, probably, but then your car gets hit, and now you have to make up for fixing your car. You probably didn't have insurance. All right. In that situation, because you didn't know that that was going to happen to you, just for having the intention that you wanted to donate, or you had the intention and you actually did fast, but the ritual is not complete. Just like this person, they didn't really donate the $1,000 because their car got hit in the middle of the way. They will still get rewarded for in intending to want to donate. Now, and again, like I said, when you're looking at the reward, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you, inshallah. What are menstruating women not allowed to do? So a number of different things, but here's one thing. When we talk about intercourse, there's absolutely no way, no differences of opinions that intercourse is actually haram. Foreplay is not. So foreplay is not, and of course, as long as it's outside of the menstrual area. All right. Intercourse is not haram. For foreplay is not. Tawaf, going around the Kaaba, is also haram unless this is a rukun, a pillar tawaf. A pillar tawaf has differences of opinions between scholars, especially like scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and a number of others. They said, well, if she cannot come back and she cannot stay in Mecca, then for the pillar tawaf, she would do it even if she had a cycle. So get back to, let's say at your local scholar for more details on that. Just heads up for that. Differences of opinions regarding sitting in the masjid. Can a woman that has her cycle sit in the masjid, listen to a dars? Differences of opinions on that. And the reason why they had differences of opinions regarding sitting in the masjid was really because of a hadith, one hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that he does not permit and allow the masjid to be a place for somebody that is in a state of janaba, which actually means a person that is in a state of after sexual relations and before taking a shower, and a person that is in a state of course, during a cycle. So this hadith actually has differences of opinions, just to note, okay? And that's why they had differences of opinions. The other part is the ayah, is that when the ayah was speaking about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not permit those that are in a state of janaba to walk through the masjid unless, or even sit in the masjid unless abiri sabil, unless they're walking by or passing by, they needed to fetch something and come out right away. So just wanted to let you know that sitting in the masjid, there's actually a stronger opinion, let's say the preponderant ruling, although this is a differences of opinions. Preponderant ruling is that they cannot sit in the masjid unless they were going to probably give a dars or probably listen to a dars. Just make sure you're not polluting the place. So this is one opinion. Touching on reading the Quran, again, there are differences of opinions between scholars on that. We'll talk about it later on, inshallah. The part about foreplay and intercourse during a cycle, the Prophet ﷺ, Maymuna actually said, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يباشر نساءه فوق الإزار وهن حيض. So foreplay, as long as the husband is not getting near the area, that's why Maymuna actually said that the Prophet ﷺ used to practice foreplay. What is beyond, of course, in other words, فوق الإزار, so we're talking about the navel until the knees, that area is covered, and even though they actually had their cycle. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Isna'u kulla shay'in illa nikah." You could do everything except, of course, here in nikah is really speaking about intercourse itself. All right. So the other part is that Aisha also said that the Prophet ﷺ said that he used to order her to cover the area, which is between the private part area, that is, of course, and that he would relate with her outside of that area. The ayah, because the ayah also says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ قُلْ هُوَ أَذًى, that the ayah actually says in Surah Al-Baqarah, they ask you about the cycle and say it is contaminated. It is harm. That is the cycle itself. The blood itself is where the place of harm is the place of contamination, but not the woman herself. All right. Now, can menstruating menstruating women do other forms of ritual? Well, they can do dhikr. They can learn Islam. They can listen to Quran. They can read the Quran, which is why things like even studying fiqh, doing dua, doing ta'meen, ameen, for example, for someone doing dua, or even you yourself doing dua, listening to the Quran, because Sayyidah Aisha actually said in the hadith that is actually authentic that the Prophet ﷺ used to even incline in Sayyidah Aisha's lap, and even though she had her cycle, but would read Quran. And in fact, there is another hadith which I was actually supposed to be quoting here. The Prophet ﷺ, and this is the main quote for all the different the different issues here. I should have actually mentioned that as the main quote, which is when Sayyidah Aisha, listen to this, is Sayyidah Aisha, when they went in the 10th year Hijrah, and Sayyidah Aisha went with the Prophet ﷺ for Hajj. The Prophet ﷺ comes back and Sayyidah Aisha was crying. So the Prophet ﷺ said, لَعَلَّكِ نَفِسْتِ. لَعَلَّكِ نَفِسْتِ. Did you get your cycle? And she actually thought that that was the end of her Hajj. She started crying and she said, I did. So the Prophet ﷺ just told her, well, this is a matter that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed on the women of the children of Adam. It's like nothing to cry about. But then he explained a very important explanation. He said, افعلي ما يفعله الحاج غير ألا تطوفي بالبيت. Do what a person in Hajj is doing, but don't go around the Kaaba in tawaf. All right, don't go around the Kaaba in tawaf. So what does a person in Hajj actually do? Well, they would read Quran, they would do the dhikr, they would do dua, they would do tasbih, etc. All these different things. All these different things, and they would do sa'i. So she can do sa'i. No need to actually abstain from sa'i. So you could even slaughter if you're strong enough to actually slaughter. Go ahead. All right. So, and at the same time, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually narrated in a Sahihain. So it's an authentic hadith. Atiyah actually says, I heard the Prophet ﷺ actually say that the women that are the virgin women, the women that are having their cycles, that they would actually go and even be present for the Eid prayers, and that they would basically listen to the ceremony, they would watch the dua, they would, in other words, engage in what they are engaging in during that dhikr moment for the Eid ceremony and Eid prayer. But he said, وَيَعْتَزِلِ الْحِيَّضِ الْمُصَلَّى. But let the women that are having their cycles, let them ostracize themselves from the area of prayer, even though the Eid prayer is actually not done in the masjid. It's actually done in open space, in open space other than the masjid. But he said this. Now, scholars had differences of opinions on whether that was trying to say to give more space to people to be able to congregate during the prayer, or whether that was because of the fact that they're menstruating, that they should, it's kind of like a masjid right now in where they would not be within the masjid or the prayer area. So differences of opinions between scholars on that one. And because of those differences of interpretations, that's why they went into the interpretation as to why, of course, they went into differences of interpretations on what is permissible for women to do during their cycle. So just keep that in mind. All right. Now, menstruating women and making up fasting. Women are required to make up their fast on other days. We know that one's simple, but here's one thing that's becoming very common in where we're having, different groups and saying that praying women during that women can pray during menstruation. I wanted to just explain that one, even though many of you would say, well, it's common sense, we already know that. But I wanted to explain it because of our times. Unfortunately, we're getting a lot of different let's just call them modern Muslims, unfortunately, changing Islam and actually making a new Islam and thinking that they were, using fiqh and they were using their understanding of Islam. Who knows where they're getting their Islam from, regardless. So the Prophet ﷺ the Prophet ﷺ actually said, why is it that women don't actually pray during their cycle? Because of the hadith, أَلَيْسَ إِذَا حَاضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّ وَلَمْ تَصُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ said, doesn't a woman, when she is having her cycle, does not pray and does not fast? There is also hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said to Sahabiya, Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, he told her, if the bleeding was the cycle bleeding, it would be blackish red with a smell. There is another qira'ah for the hadith, not damun aswadun yu'raf or yu'rif, sorry, but yu'raf. What's the difference? Blackish, reddish color that is known. In other words, it's distinguishable. Women know it. The other interpretation, damun aswadun yu'rif, which means it's a darkish, blackish color, cycle bleeding that has an odor. So yu'rif actually means has a smell. Yu'raf means that women would distinguish it by its texture. So the Prophet ﷺ then continues after explaining what is a cycle bleeding, and he says, فَأَمْسِكِي عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ. Then hold off your prayer during that time if you're recognizing that this is a cycle. He said, فَأَمْسِكِي. The word فَأَمْسِكِي is actually an imperative verb, which actually means hold off your prayer. In other words, it's an order. Don't pray, that is. And فَإِذَا كَانَ الْآخَرْ فَتَوَضَّئِ. If it is the other type of bleeding, فَتَوَضَّئِ فَإِنَّمَا هُوَ عِرْقٌ. Then make your wudu, because this is just an internal bleeding. In other words, it has nothing to do with the other type of bleeding, which is the cycle. فَإِنَّمَا هُوَ عِرْقٌ. It's like saying that it is a vein that simply just that had a bruise or something, so it could be for different reasons. The other hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, أَلَيْسَ إِذَا حَضَتْ. This is a hadith, أَلَيْسَ إِذَا حَضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّ وَلَمْ تَصُمْ, which is right there. You could see this hadith is actually narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. Isn't it that a woman, when she gets her cycle, she does not pray and does not fast? There is another hadith where Sayyidah Aisha said, كنا نؤمر بقضاء الصوم ولا نؤمر بقضاء الصلاة. Sayyidah Aisha said, we used to be ordered to make up the fast, and we were not ordered to make up our prayers. Rawahu Muslim. This is narrated in Muslim, so it's an authentic hadith. In Nawawi, a Syrian scholar, in fact, he is considered the leading scholar for the whole madhab of Shafi'i. And he actually said, أجمعت الأمة على أنه يحرم على الحائض الصلاة, the fard and the nafil of it. So what did he say? He said scholars had unanimously agreed that women are forbidden to pray, and for whether that was an obligatory prayer or a non-obligatory prayer, it would be haram for her to pray in. You could see this book is Al-Majmu' al-Nawawi right there, and you can go back to it. What if she feels the symptoms of a period? Does she stop fasting? Well, her fast is complete and is not invalidated. So what does that mean? So even if she feels the symptoms, her fast is complete, but she didn't get an actual bleeding. The fasting is complete and is not invalidated according to the correct view, because there's no ruling connected to blood that is still inside the body. So the body, you know that within an hour that she should be getting the period. As long as you didn't actually see any discharge, then your fast is okay. Your ritual on that day is complete and you don't have to make it up. So what is the evidence? Well, the Prophet ﷺ actually said regarding a different issue, but it is really the same. When he was asked about a woman who sees in a dream what a man sees, in other words, it's a wet dream. The Prophet ﷺ said, when asked, does she have to do ghusl? He said, yes, if she sees the water, that is the discharge. So the ruling is connected to seeing the actual discharge and not body sensations. Why don't women during their cycle fast or pray? Well, here's the thing, is that this is not a punishment, okay? This is really important to mention. This is not a punishment. It is for generally the ruling is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ رَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. That the general ayah is that it's not befit for a believing man and a believing woman, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter, that they would put their opinion over the Lord Almighty. Now, or even their opinion over the Prophet, peace be upon him's opinion. Now, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on why menstruating women do not fast, or they shouldn't be fasting. Some of them said that the reason is not known to us, just like, for example, Imam al-Haramain. He actually said, we don't know why her fast is not valid because purity is not a prerequisite for it. And then others actually said the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbidden menstruating women to fast at the time of their period is out of mercy towards them. In other words, we don't really know. It's rahmah min Rabbil Alameen, mercy towards them. That's it. Because loss of blood weakens them. And if women were to fast when menstruating, she would be weakened by both menstruating and by fasting, and which in which case fasting would be unfair burden and may be harmful. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he actually said, with regard to menstruation, he said, we say Islam brings moderation in all things, and going to extremes in worship is a kind of unfairness that the lawgiver, which is Allah Almighty, forbids and commands us to be moderate in worship. In other words, it is not whatsoever any type of punishment. In fact, out of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he actually forbid that women would fast to maintain, whether it's the different liquids, the different nutrients that their body needs in order to give them a healthy body. So don't fast, and it's not a punishment. No shower or ghusl is required, so before suhoor. So what does that mean? Let's say her cycle finished, okay? Let's say her cycle finished, but then she didn't take a shower yet, and she has to do suhoor really quick, but she doesn't have enough time to do the shower before doing the suhoor because Fajr is going to make the adhan. You don't have to worry about that because tahara is not a prerequisite for fasting anyways. All right. So even if you delayed your ghusl after Fajr adhan, that's all right. Do your suhoor if you need to, and then do your shower later on, even after Fajr, meaning Fajr adhan, because you would have to do your ghusl for Salat al-Fajr. So don't miss out on that. So we just wanted to make that one in where Sayyidah Aisha actually said that the Prophet ﷺ used to wake up junub as the result of intercourse, of course, not a wet dream, and he would fast in Ramadan. So this hadith is actually authentic. In other words, tahara is not a prerequisite for fasting. What if the period ended in midday Ramadan? Does that mean she has to continue fasting for the rest of the day? Well, here's the thing. Although many scholars have said that the person who had the temporary reason to break the fast and then later the reason is gone, that such as reaching the destination for a traveler or a woman's period stopping, that they're supposed to be refraining from eating for the rest of the day. Really, there is no evidence on that, but to say that that is respect for the day. It was really based on a hadith for Siyam Ashura, in where the Prophet ﷺ, on that day, he actually said, let those that had already eaten, let them hold up, in order to hold off from eating until the rest of the day. So they said, well, this is because Ashura is a sacred day, so the Prophet ﷺ ordered them to do that. And some of them actually based it on, well, they said if Ashura, which is not an obligatory fast, how is it with Ramadan? It's an obligatory fast. So they related it, well, it's to respect and honor that day, and therefore the person would hold on. Well, here's the thing, is that the other scholars that said, no, they don't have to refrain from eating and drinking for the rest of the day. They said giving respect for the day is one side, but when we're looking at the ritual itself is actually not complete because they didn't start off their day with, one, the intention to fast, two, with not eating and drinking from that time, which is dawn time. So therefore, their fast is anyways not complete. Therefore, regardless of whether they stopped and refrained from eating and drinking in midday, or whether they, was part of the at the end of the day, they're going to make up that fast. So in other words, this is a considerable opinion, and Allahu Alam, they do not have to refrain from eating and drinking for the rest of the day. And this is the view of an Imam Malik and Shafi'i, and is also one of the narrations of Al-Hanbali as well, which is why when so we've got a narration right there that Ibn Mas'ud, he actually said, whoever eats at the beginning of the day, let him eat at the end. So if it was permissible for him not to fast at the beginning of the day, then it's permissible not to eat at the end of it as well. So do menopausal women actually get periods if the bleeding has a period texture? Remember the period texture, blackish red, thick, with a smell, all right? So then it's a period. And remember the general rule that if we're talking about vaginal bleeding, the general rule is that it's a period unless proven otherwise. If it's any other spotting, it's pinkish in color, for example, or even if it's red, but it doesn't have a smell, it's not thick like a period, then I would say this is istihada, regardless of your menopausal or not. It can happen that women after their menopause, that they can, all of a sudden get a real period, all right? It can happen. So istihada, let's look at istihada. We talked about the prolonged blood flow. It could be, different reasons. We mentioned that. And the base of that type of bleeding is really this hadith that Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, we talked about this hadith, that she asked the Prophet ﷺ, and she said, looks like Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, she would have really needed an OB during her time, but unfortunately she didn't have that access to an OB. So she used to get this constant bleeding. And in fact, she said, Inni ustahadu fala atur. She said she was getting this constant bleeding. Her bleeding never stops. I don't know if she was anemic at all because of that. And she said, do I stop praying? So the Prophet ﷺ said, no, that is just a vein. So in other words, it's an internal bleeding that's not related to an unfertilized egg or anything of that sort. But stop and refrain from prayer the same amount of days that you used to refrain from prayer during your cycle days. And then اغتسلي, take a shower, and then pray. So what does that actually mean? You could see that Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh was getting some kind of a health issue, all right? And she was saying that she was constantly bleeding. So there was a time where her body was healthy, and the Prophet ﷺ told her to use that as the basis for knowing when her or how many days are her cycle days, and then base it on that. Well, here's one thing. How do I know if it's istihada? Number one is that the color is not blackish red. The quantity is not what we're looking for. In fact, the quantity can be sometimes even more than an actual cycle, probably because she had some kind of ovarian cyst or some kind of a surgery, etc. Then that quantity could actually be more than a period. She's probably changing a pad probably every 15 minutes. She's got an issue here, all right? It's not thick like syrup and doesn't clot. It does clot, okay? But that is really confusing for women to mention. There's no odor. Cramping can also happen, but usually doesn't happen for istihada, but it can happen. So some of the reasons for it, we're probably talking about stress, birth control, using birth control where it's taking her cycle differently and putting it somewhere else. You could see it's probably ovulation spotting, premenstrual spotting, different things, pregnancy spotting, actually, after the first time, sexual spotting, post-sexual spotting. This is actually istihada. All those are actually istihada. Maybe the premenstrual one, we would have to look further into that. But this is just an even ovulation spotting. So it could be that during the time of probably the egg reaching into and attaching to the uterus, she might actually get some spotting and think that it's a period, when in reality she was actually just having that egg attached to the uterus right there, and it's a totally different thing, and that would actually be considered as istihada. So look at those ones. All right, so let's move on. Whoops. Vaginal discharges actually take the ruling of istihada. So I want to actually look at that one right there, because when we're looking at any other discharge, so whether we're talking about the yellowish green, which is usually due to a sexually transmitted infection, or whether we're talking about gray, which is a bacterial infection or something like that, or whether we're talking about the cervical bleeding, vaginal irritation, implantation, bleeding, or whether we're talking about ovulation, hormonal imbalances, the different types of discharges, all of those are actually going to take the same ruling as istihada. In fact, even some of the red ones, so cervical infection, that's not going to actually take the istihada ruling. A cervical polyp, endometrial or cervical cancer, all right, reasons, those are all going to take as istihada. So just because it happens to be red or it happens to be pink, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a period. So I want to look into that, and that's why it's really important to be able to distinguish the menstrual one. All right, so when we're looking at the yellow discharge, if it's outside of the period timing, and then if it's outside the period timing, then that would actually be istihada. But if it is within the cycle time and you're seeing yellow discharge, that would actually mean your period didn't end yet. It's actually a mixture of the different internal fluids with the red cycle that's not yet finished, along with the white cervical mucus. So in that situation, the yellowish discharge, if it is within the period time, it is actually part of the period. It's actually part of the period, and therefore you would actually consider it as still part of your cycle. That's why Sayyidah Aisha, there are actually two hadith. Sayyidah Aisha actually said that the women, or it was narrated that Sayyidah Aisha, that the women used to send her bidurja, kind of like a pad, and it would have yellowish discharge, and she would say, don't rush until you see the white cervical mucus. Atiyah actually said something otherwise, that she said, كنا لا نعد الصفرة والكدرة بعد الطهر شيئا. We did not used to consider the yellowish and the brownish discharge after being pure of a cycle anything. In other words, it wasn't considered anything. This report is not contradictory to this report. This report is speaking about the yellowish discharge, or the different colored discharges during the time of the cycle. That's when she said, don't rush until you find the white cervical mucus. Atiyah is explaining in a different instance that happens, in where if you're getting a yellowish discharge or brownish discharge, if it is outside of the cycle time, then it would not be considered part of a cycle, and therefore you would actually consider it as the spotting, just like istihada. All right, so IUDs. The IUDs tend to be probably the most confusing for most women, because when you're actually talking about an IUD, especially if we're talking about the Mirena one with hormones, hold off, we're going to explain it. So before you actually seek to insert an IUD, you have to seek your OB to see which one is right for you. There are two kinds. There's the Mirena one, and there's which is the 5-year one. And usually, or actually, this is the one with the hormone. Then there's the 10-year one, which is the Paragard, which is right there. All right, the copper one. And when one thing I would like to say is that the your OB is going to want to insert it at the end of your cycle. Here's what happens. Usually when it is inserted, women would then get more bleeding and they would think that the period just increased in time. Not quite. This is not quite the case. So in that situation, you're going to calculate based on the number of days you used to get your cycle for, and then you're going to base it off that, and then the extra days that you started getting the bleeding because of inserting the IUD, those are actually called istihada. Now, one thing is that scholars actually had differences of opinions on the Mirena one because of the hormones that are in it and because of the way that it actually is, because of the way that it actually stops the pregnancy, and where after an actual fertilized egg, and then it releases it later on. So kind of like a plan B, the plan B type of medication, let's call it that way. All right. I'm not sure what they usually call the plan B type of thing. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. All right. So the 10-year one actually prevents the pregnancy from happening from the beginning. What about the other spotting? So the other spotting is when you're looking at the other spotting, you could see that it's basically the istihada that we're talking about. So it's not a period, doesn't have a flow. The timing is different. The duration is different. And that spotting is actually going to be that istihada. So what are the different cases of istihada? One, you could have a regular period, but for some reason, an overflow had happened. That overflow is actually usually an istihada, but not always. Because even if you have a regular period, your cycle is not necessarily going to be the same every single day, or, well, not every day, okay, every month. Sometimes you'll have a strong period, and another month you might have a little weaker. All right. So that's actually totally normal. So a time frame, let's say your cycle is 6 days. So a time of days of 6, 7, 8 days, that's within the time. If you're looking at the texture, it still has a period texture. Remember, we talked about that before. If it has a period texture, a day or two difference is still considered a regular period, and it's still considered a period. So don't rush. All right. But if we're talking about a sister that has a regular cycle, but let's say an overflow that is different just happened, then in that situation, we're going to say, what really happened? Well, she's going to say, I was having, every single month I would get 6, 7 days as the cycle, but then all of a sudden I went all the way to 15 and I'm not really sure what happened. So that overflow that is beyond the 7 days, because the sister is a regular cycle days, we're going to say what is beyond 7 days is going to be the days of your istihada. And if you did not pray on those days, you're going to have to make up the prayer, and even, of course, make up all the fast. So what about an irregular cycle or an irregular period, where a sister might have a period, maybe 2 months not have a cycle, and then one day she would get for 15 days. Another sister might actually have 10 days. The other time she might have it for 5 days, and she's just totally not regular. So in that situation, the sister is going to actually look at the period structure, what the period features, the smell, and she's going to look at the smell. She's going to look at that thickness. Remember what we talked about? Those period structure, that is what she's going to be basing it on. So she's going to look at that structure and identify. By the way, an irregular period sister might actually be maybe getting bleeding throughout the whole year. She's constantly bleeding. So in that situation, she would look at the texture of the bleeding in order to identify which of the days are actually her period and which are not. What if the sister is constantly bleeding and she's not able to distinguish whatsoever? So in that situation, we would use 1, genetics. 2, if she had a history of having a normal period, we would use that as well. And then we would say, well, for every 21 to 28 days, you're going to take 6 to 7 days as a period days, even though you weren't able to distinguish it's constantly bleeding. So we're going to ask you to take 6 to 7 days. as your period. And if you're not able to distinguish it even with texture, that's fair enough. Use 6 to 7 days. You're going to consider that those are my period days. And then 21 to 28 days later, as if you didn't have a period, and then so forth. So this is how you're going to do it. What about the menarche, those girls that get their period for the first time? So in that situation, we would say, let your mother or a guardian help you determine the period from the other bleeding. Genetics is important to help you determine. So ask your mom, your aunts, the average number of days. You're going to use that, and then you're going to be the same thing as istihada. You're going to say, well, the average number of days is that 6 to 7 days, for example, or 8 days. Then you're going to look at it that way. But if the mother looks at it and she says, well, this is actually like a cycle, and even if it's up to 15 days, no more than 15 days, according to the Shafi'i, then in that situation, you're going to say, what's a period? It has all the textures for it. And because she's a monarchy, this is very common. Menarche girls actually get very long ones, and sometimes they would get very long periods, very heavy, and then it stops for a whole year or maybe a couple months. This is absolutely normal. All right. So generally speaking, then we would say, well, let's look at you being able to distinguish it, help your mother help you distinguish that, and then you're going to use the genetics factor and see the average of it, and then you're going to, if it's too long, then we're going to say, well, it can't be more than 15 days in that situation. All right. So you can't say it's a whole month, even though she can bleed for a whole month, by the way. But we're going to say it's not more than 15 days. And according to the Hanafi, it's not more than 10 days. So istihada does not affect praying, fasting, tawaf, reading in Quran. Intercourse does not count for a divorce or a waiting period either. How does a woman with istihada perform her prayer? Well, she may use a tampon if she's married, and a regular pad, and she doesn't have to do anything specific. Make wudu for every salah. That's the only specific thing that she has to do, and may even combine prayers. What does combine prayers actually mean? So she would delay dhuhr, let's say the last 10 minutes of the last 10 minutes. When does she combine? Well, it's not that she always combines. It's only because it's becoming hectic for those women to constantly make wudu for every salah. So it could be too cold. It could be she's just finding it too hard for her, probably getting skin rashes because of constant wudu, etc. So she would really like to use that. She can actually delay what is called al-jam' al-suri. She would delay dhuhr to the last 10 minutes and then pray asr 10 minutes during its time. All right. So delay dhuhr in the last 10 minutes and then pray asr early. So in that situation, she's actually praying dhuhr and asr with the same wudu. Maghrib and isha, delay maghrib to the last 10 minutes, for example, pray isha during the beginning of it. And that way she'll just be making one wudu rather than making a maghrib wudu and isha wudu and so forth. So we're just giving the options right there. Certain guidelines, if you had the reason to break your fast, you don't have to announce that you're eating and drinking and show that you're not fasting, unless you don't want to be accused of lacking religious commitment by those that don't really know your excuse. And others view that if the reason for the excuse is too obvious, then there's nothing wrong with showing them. So if we as women, we're having a women gathering, all right, and you were eating, between us women, we just know that, yeah, we we know each other, and we're not going to accuse one another because we know our situations. Then in that situation, you don't really have to break in secret. All right, you can actually break it in front of all of us as women. And of course, during istihada, this is a very important topic because there's nothing in the Quran or Sunnah that actually prevents intercourse during istihada, and scholars really had differences of opinions. Preponderant is that it's permissible, and the Shawkani, one of the Shafi'i scholars, actually said, وَلَمْ يَرِدْ فِي ذَلِكَ شَرْعٌ يَقْتَضِي الْمَنْعَ مِنْهُ. There's nothing in text in the Quran or Sunnah that reveals or proves that it is prohibited. All right. So frequently asked questions, reading Quran for menstruating women, generally speaking. Okay. Scholars had differences of opinions. Majority of the scholars actually said menstruating women should not be reading Quran. The majority of the scholars. But here's one thing, is that there's actually nothing All right. There's actually nothing in the Quran. Remember the hadith that I said I was supposed to be quoting and mentioning within the slides, and I forgot when the Sayyidah Aisha, when the Prophet ﷺ comes to Sayyidah Aisha during Hajj and she's crying right there, and the Prophet ﷺ comforts her that, this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed on the women of Adam, etc., and do what Hajj is doing, what a person during pilgrimage is doing, except don't do tawaf. Well, that's the same base, actually. There are some scholars that use that, and they said, well, a woman or a man during pilgrimage, they read Quran, they do dhikr, they do istighfar. So same thing. They said, well, that is actually a basis for it. So as for the hadith that a woman during her cycle or a person in state of janaba, that is after intercourse and before taking a shower, does not read anything from Quran, Ibn Taymiyyah said that this is actually a weak hadith. This is actually a weak hadith, and that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the women used to get their cycles, and there was nothing reported as authentic to actually prevent them from reading Quran. If they were supposed to not read the Quran, we would have had an authentic report. All right, but this is an opinion, and I actually take it as preponderant. But just to let you know, majority actually said otherwise. Dhikr with tasbih, there's nothing wrong to prevent them. Can I use a contraceptive pill to delay my period? Is a common question. Well, it's best to let your body take its course. You can if you would like. I would recommend for it for Hajj and Umrah. Recommend for Hajj and Umrah, but you do not have to whatsoever. You can decide otherwise. How do I know if the cycle is finished? Well, one, if it's dry, in other words, you stop getting bleeding, and the area you don't see anything discharged. So in other words, the bleeding stops. So it's dry now. Or if you get white cervical mucus, that actually tells you that there's nothing going to be spotting any longer. What about the dryness? You can wait for a whole day to make sure that the spotting completely finished. So you don't have to take a shower every half an hour and think, oh, I spotted again. Take a shower. I spotted again. You don't have to. You can wait a whole day before you do that. So do I have to repeat those prayers and make up those prayers on that day when I thought that the cycle is finished? Some scholars said yes. Majority actually said yes, because on that day you really didn't have a cycle. You were just trying to be sure. All right. So you had not done the prayers when you really were finished with your cycle, but you were just trying to be sure. So you do have to make up those prayers. How do I shower? Well, you could just spill the water over you, okay? Or the sunnah way, wudu, you make wudu first, you wash the private part for making the wudu, and then you do the rest of the wudu. You make a complete body wash. Don't forget your mouth and nose, with differences of opinions between scholars, and then make wudu again. This is the sunnah way. What if I didn't do the sunnah way? By spilling water over you, you're finished. All right, just make sure you wash your private part as well. What if the period ended and I was not able to make ghusl? I was at school, or as I was at my work or something, and I couldn't run and go back to my home and make ghusl and come back. So in that situation, you can make tayammum. So what does that mean? You can make tayammum on rocks. You can make tayammum on sand, on soil. So those are the three different things that you could actually make tayammum on. So even if you grab a rock, for example, right, from schoolyard or whatever, and actually do it as if it's a bar of soap, and you can actually, you don't have to pat it, but you can even scrub your hands with it, and then you would wipe your face once, and then you would wipe on the top of your palms and on the top of your palms, so on the back of your palms and on the inside of your palms, and then you are ready to make your salah. So some of the cervical mucus, I would like to explain that one. Sorry for putting in this image, but I think it's really important to mention because many sisters are confused about it. Here's one thing. I'm gonna take out the image because I don't want people getting disgusted. Okay, now we're talking about the cervical mucus. So for the cervical mucus, scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether, one, that's a wudu breaker, two, on whether cervical mucus is actually pure or not, meaning how does it actually affect your prayer? How does it affect your wudu? So the reason why they had differences of opinions is really because there is no hadith or ayah speaking about it. All right. So where did they get it from? Well, the reason for that is because the scholars, they looked at the different things. All right, the scholars actually looked at the different things that lead to breaking the wudu, and by doing, let's just call it that scrutiny and looking at the pattern. So they looked at the pattern, they said, well, vomit, bleeding, um, pus, urine, feces. These things are bodily discharges, and therefore they are najis. So they looked at it, any bodily discharge, especially from the or private area, is najis. But other scholars said, well, wait a minute, that's too much of a generalization. Yes, we could look at urine, you could look feces, we could look at pus, we could look at bleeding, but not every body fluid is necessarily a najis. So that's why when you look at the cervical mucus, there's really no hadith or ayah, which is why there was a huge debate between scholars on that. So some scholars said, well, it's a body fluid, then therefore it breaks the wudu. And the other scholars said, it's a body fluid, but there's no hadith or ayah. And of course, women didn't just suddenly start having cervical mucus. Certainly they were having the cervical discharge even the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But the Prophet ﷺ never said anything about it. So therefore, to actually speak up about it right now is actually making it hard on women, because the Prophet ﷺ didn't talk about it, even though for sure women were getting it. All right. So for that situation, there was this huge debate, really. So the first opinion said it's a wudu breaker and also an impurity. So what does that mean? If we say it's a wudu breaker, that actually is straightforward. You got to redo your wudu if you get it. An impurity actually means you got to change your garment. The second opinion said it's a wudu breaker, but not an impurity. So what does that mean? They said it's a wudu breaker, you have to redo your wudu, but it doesn't mean that it's an impurity, because in other words, if you get it on your garment, on undergarment, that you have to change. You don't have to. That's a second opinion. The third opinion said it's not a wudu breaker, and it's not an impurity either, because there's no hadith and no ayah speaking about it. And this is umum al-balwa. This is actually happening to all women, especially for younger girls. So the teenagers, and if you're doing lots of workout and etc., then you're going to be getting that. Not to mention that it's constantly there in your body. And to actually increase and add more obligations on women is really making their life hectic, and for something that was not mentioned. Now, here's the thing. So what is the preponderant, even though we just heard that? Well, it's best to redo your wudu, but and of course, using those carefree things to make sure that your garment is clean. All right. But if, let's say, those circumstances where you were shopping, you were at school, and you got that and you didn't know what to do, you can take the opinion that it is, one, not a wudu breaker, and two, not an impure substance, and therefore you can actually pray. You can take that opinion as well. So I hope I answered all the questions that are usually coming up, and I would be happy to listen to the questions. So go ahead, and this is actually the end of our slides. Go ahead. I don't know who it.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Aisha. Yeah, we did have a few questions. Sorry, I'm just gonna pull them up right now. So one of the questions was,
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Apologies. There's someone in the chat who asked if our menstruation is not smooth, will it make it difficult to have children?
So I'm not an OB. I'm not an OB. That's not a question for me.
Also, one of the questions was, what about the bleeding that comes after weaning a breastfed baby that is for 3 to 4 days and very light? Is that istihada?
So she's, the weaning usually comes, that bleeding because of weaning usually comes if we're talking about the time of nifas, which is the time of postpartum. So she's not going to basically necessarily consider the weaning as the main issue. Yes, it does contribute, but generally speaking, she's going to look at the texture of it because it depends on when she started weaning. Okay, it depends on when she started weaning. Most of the times it's actually istihada. All right, but it can be a cycle because when she's starting to wean, her body is starting to ovulate, and then she can be getting a period. So she has to look at the texture. All right, so it's not that, oh, if you're weaning you get spotting, that means istihada. Not too fast. When she's weaning, she could be starting to ovulate again and probably getting a cycle. So she's going to look at the texture of it.
Thank you. Another question is, does your Hajj still count if you're on your period?
Oh, absolutely. There are certain things that, like I said, the tawaf, but there's a there's the tawaf al-rukun she would have to do. So yes, the Hajj and the Umrah, they are actually considered. There are certain things that she would have to do, like during, for example, during al-ihram, during the time of being at the miqat, that she would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she would make the niyyah that, my ihram would end where I am, habastani, basically that's the term. So there are certain things. So I would say, speak to your guide and the person that is actually specialized in this during Hajj, but generally, yes, the Hajj and the Umrah are actually considered, inshallah, accepted.
I think another sister had a question, was regarding the fasting in the period. If you don't check until way after the fast has ended and you have started your period, should you just assume you should make it up?
So generally speaking, if for example, all right, she didn't feel anything, all right, and she was just, busy cooking and all that, and she didn't feel anything, and she had her iftar, but after having her iftar and everything, and then she runs to the restroom and realizes that, oh, I was actually spotting and I didn't recognize it. So she's going to assume, all right, because she didn't feel anything, she's going to assume that her fast was actually valid and that the spotting happened later after the iftar, not before. But if she felt something and wasn't really sure what that was, and she didn't really check really quick, didn't have the time, maybe her fryer was on and all that, and then she didn't check until after iftar, we're going to say, did you feel anything discharging? It's like, yeah, I felt something discharging, but I didn't really have the time to go check it out. We will say, well, that discharge was actually when you were capable of finding out what it was, that, and you discovered that it was your cycle, and that would actually, you're announcing that your fast was not actually valid.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. Sorry, sister, I know that we've run over the time, so is it okay if we still ask a few more questions?
Yeah, absolutely, go ahead.
Jazakallah khairan. Another one, a sister asked, would your fast be broken if you had a wet dream and saw water during a nap?
Oh, absolutely not. Your fast is not broken. You do have to make a shower, but your fast is absolutely not broken.
Okay.
Whether it's a man or a woman, that doesn't break the fast whatsoever. Absolutely not. Not one scholar said it does.
Okay. Another question was, if I get a tiny pink clot discharge a few days before the actual period, do I pray and fast during or after the pink discharge prior actual menstrual bleeding?
Say that again. Do it again.
Yeah, sorry, I think I'll reword it. So I think it's sister saying that if she got a tiny pink clot of discharge a few days before her actual menstrual bleeding, should she pray and fast whilst she's having that clotting beforehand?
Right. So that's the spotting before the cycle that is common. All right. So if it doesn't have a period texture, then that is actually just the before the cycle spotting. Sometimes it happens. So that's an istihada. That's why we talked about the texture in the beginning. That's basically the easiest way to indicate, oh, is what spotting is this? How do I understand this? So this is an istihada spotting.
Okay. Another one was what counts as traveling so that you can break your fast?
So we're talking about 81 kilometers and up. Some scholars said, no, it's not an issue of how many kilometers. It's an issue of if you departed the city area. So let's say you're in London, okay? You departed all of London and you're right now, yes, you are still in UK, but you're in Birmingham. You're way far. All right. So in that situation, you have really departed the city area, including the suburbs of your city. So in that situation, you can actually shorten your prayer.
Okay. There's another question for what's the ruling on using contraceptives such as IUDs?
So it is permissible to actually use those. You just want to make sure that you get, your husband's permission. You want to make it not your own decision. It's it's your husband and your decision together. So if both of you agree on it, then go for it. If you don't both agree on it, then we're going to look at the circumstances. Why do you need to have it? Why do you think it's important? And then they can have a conversation and we'll go from there. If, for example, we're looking at, oh, she's, her body is, let's say, if she gets pregnant, there's danger, etc. Then in that situation, if there's danger, then she could definitely have an IUD inserted or even other methods done because her health becomes our priority.
Okay. This other question, I think you mentioned it in the talk, but I think someone just wanted to clarify if all girls were allowed to wear tampons.
So the reason why I mentioned that the girls, that the virgin, let's say it that way, is because there are different types of hymens for women, and for some, using a tampon might rupture the hymen. Scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether a person's virginity is determined based on the hymen or based on a sexual experience. In other words, married or not have had a marriage relationship before. All right. So I just wanted to stay on the safe side and just stay what is called in fiqh al-khuruj min al-khilafi awla, staying away from the differences of opinions between scholars. So that's why I mentioned that one really, but it's not haram per se, but just staying on the safe side because not rupturing the hymen, for example, is actually for some scholars what determines a woman's virginity, even though what determines a virginity cannot necessarily be the hymen, because it can rupture by even a heavy blood flow. But just respect, let's say it that way, culture, and some things about culture and how they see that. So just khuruj min al-khilafi awla, staying on the safe side and keeping that in mind. I understand that women's bodies are different, but just wanted to mention that one just to stay on the safe side, really. But just keep a note of that.
Okay, thank you. I think this may be the last question. Someone asked, does reading include touching the Quran? So I think they're talking about when you're on your period.
Right. So this is actually a huge and a long debate between scholars. And the reason why is that, one, there's an ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. None shall touch it but those that are in a state of purity. And the scholars had differences of opinions on whether لا يمسه, which is the pronoun ha, none shall touch it, whether that it or the pronoun ha, whether it's referring to the Quran or whether it's referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz. The other thing is that the hadith that actually considered that women and basically were added to a person in state of janaba, that they shall not read Quran or touch the Quran. There are actually differences of opinions between scholars on the let's say the authenticity of those ahadith, and that's why there was that debate as well. The third one, which is, remember the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ actually told the Sayyidah Aisha when she was crying, etc. You guys remember the hadith? I think we said it 3 times now. So based on that, they said, well, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, if Ali ma yaf'aluhu al-hajj, do what a person during pilgrimage is doing. So therefore, including reading Quran, she was not excluded or told not to read Quran. So those are the differences. Those are the different opinions right there, or sorry, the different evidences right there. The other scholars that said she doesn't read Quran, they based it on the ayah as well. They said لا يمسه إلا المطهرون is actually the pronoun. It is referring to the Quran, and they said that the hadith, even though they're not necessarily authentic in each and every single one of them, but in group, that they would authenticate one another. That's a whole usuli debate right there. The usuli debate right there. It's a long one. And number 3, they said we would do qiyas. We would do qiyas, which is doing an analogy, and said the analogy is just like a person in a state of janaba, that they would actually refrain from reading Quran. Ibn Hazm did not consider that as preponderant. In fact, Ibn Hazm literally mocked that opinion. And Ibn Hazm is a great scholar, by the way. So don't think because of Ibn Hazm think that he's not a great scholar. He actually is one of the greatest scholars of times. Ibn Hazm said that you cannot actually do that analogy because that person has a very temporary time, and a woman during her cycle has a long number of days. If she were to refrain from reading Quran, what really is left of her ritual, what really is left of her Islam? And that's actually taking away salah, siyam, reading Quran and dhikr, or taking out even attending masjid, and that's going to affect her deen. So I personally regard that as a preponderant opinion, and reading Quran, and it's not whatsoever. I know I've seen some that actually thought that was somehow trying to, I would say, embrace the modern Western stance or feminist stance. Not whatsoever. Go ahead and see how I would attack feminism. I don't have a problem with saying straightforward, if something is in the text and proven to be authentic, I don't care what the feminists would say. I don't care what the West would say. I will say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, qala Allah wa qala Rasul, is on top of all. But when there are differences of opinions between scholars and the evidences, the text is actually giving me something different, I'm not here trying to somehow, I would, do some kind of a mughazala, some kind of trying to attract the Western perspective whatsoever. This is actually looking at the text. So it's the text that defines our ritual. It's the text that defines how we stand in terms of ritual and in terms of prayer and in terms of worship, in terms of ethics, and not whatsoever what the common trend wants us to believe. And I consider that the preponderant ruling, wallahu a'lam, is that a woman during her cycle can read the Quran, can memorize the Quran, and can do the tasbih, can do the dhikr, and can do all that. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakallah khairan. I think there's just one last question in the chat box, and that was, if a woman thinks her period has finished, so makes ghusl, but then her husband has intercourse with her and more blood comes out, is there any sin in this?
There is no sin, because she didn't know. They didn't know that there was her cycle didn't finish. So nothing to do whatsoever.
Jazakallah khairan. I think that's the end of all the questions. We just want to say, like, Jazakallah khairan to you for all your time and for delivering this extensive talk to us, as it's a topic that many of us don't have enough knowledge on, and you definitely informed a lot of us on things that we did not know before. It was an honor to host you today. Alhamdulillah.
Jazakum Allah khairan and barakallahu fikum and Rabbi yahfadkum. If you can send me a copy of the recording, that would be extremely nice. Assalamu alaikum.
Of course. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khairan to all the attendees. This was a collab between Westminster and Goldsmith sisters, and inshallah the first of many more to come.
I did actually put, sorry to interrupt, I did actually
No, it's fine.
the WhatsApp link for those that would like to attend future lectures, and my YouTube page as well. Inshallah, I can put that as well.
Jazakallah khairan. Okay, everyone, so just see that's in the chat box if you wanted to go to that, inshallah. We'll send the links to the group chats as well. So,
All right,
so follow
inshallah.
that.
Jazakumullah khairan.
Barakallahu feek. We'll also be making notes of this topic. So we'll be compiling that and we'll be sending that to the sisters group chats and probably posting on Instagram as well, inshallah, afterwards for everyone to access. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.